The morning mist clings to the runway at Duxford Airfield on September 3, 1940, the kind of heavy English fog that makes everything beyond 50 yards dissolve into gray uncertainty. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Webb sits in the cockpit of his Supermarine Spitfire, hands resting on controls that have become as familiar as his own heartbeat after 3 months of combat over the Channel. The engine ticks as it cools from the pre-flight run-up, a mechanical rhythm that measures the minutes before the scramble bell will inevitably ring. Webb is 22 years old, has been flying operationally for 11 weeks, and has developed a habit that makes his squadron mates roll their eyes and his flight commander shake his head in disapproval. When German fighters engage him, when the Messerschmitts come diving from the sun with cannon fire stitching the air, Webb does something that violates every principle of aerial combat taught at the RAF's fighter schools. He skids. Not the coordinated gentle skid used for gunnery adjustments or landing approaches, but a violent ham-fist maneuver that throws his Spitfire sideways through the sky like a drunk stumbling away from a bar fight. His rudder pedals slam full deflection while his ailerons fight to keep the wings level, creating a motion so ugly, so apparently amateur, that experienced pilots watching from other aircraft wince at the spectacle. Squadron leader Henderson has told him repeatedly that the skid wastes energy, compromises situational awareness, and makes him a sitting target for any competent enemy pilot who recognizes what he is doing. But Webb keeps doing it anyway, and in the brutal arithmetic of the Battle of Britain, where survival measured itself in weeks and most pilots were dead before they learned to survive, Webb has become uncatchable. German pilots report him to their intelligence officers with frustration bordering on confusion, describing an RAF pilot who flies like a student yet manages to evade attacks that should have been lethal. In the next 6 months, that amateur skid will save Webb's life 14 times, will force the Luftwaffe to rewrite sections of their tactical doctrine, and will demonstrate that sometimes the most effective response to sophisticated tactics is a maneuver so crude that opponents cannot believe anyone would actually attempt it. To understand why Webb's skid violated everything the RAF taught about fighter combat, one must first comprehend what British fighter doctrine had become by the summer of 1940, and why the doctrine represented the accumulated wisdom of pilots who had learned their trade in circumstances very different from what they now faced. The RAF's approach to air combat in 1940 descended directly from the theories developed during the Great War. Refined through 2 decades of peacetime training, and codified in manuals that emphasized coordinated flight, energy management, and the maintenance of tactical formation. Fighter pilots learned to think of their aircraft as extensions of Newtonian physics. Altitude converted to speed through diving, speed converted to altitude through climbing, turning bled energy that had to be recovered before the next engagement. The cardinal sin was wasting energy through uncoordinated flight, through maneuvers that created drag without corresponding tactical advantage. The skid, in this framework, represented everything a fighter pilot should avoid. It generated massive drag as the aircraft's fuselage pushed through the air sideways. It disrupted the smooth flow of air over the wings, reducing lift and forcing the pilot to add power just to maintain altitude. It made the aircraft slower, less responsive, more vulnerable to attack from any direction except the one from which the original threat had come. RAF instructors taught student pilots to recognize the skid as an emergency correction for landing approaches gone wrong, not as something that belonged anywhere near combat. The German pilots who flew Messerschmitt Bf 109ES over England in the summer and autumn of 1940 expected to encounter an enemy who fought according to a predictable pattern, whose responses to attack could be calculated and countered based on established tactical principles. The Luftwaffe had refined its fighter tactics through combat in Spain, Poland, and France, had developed a tactical language that allowed experienced pilots to coordinate attacks with radio brevity codes and practiced maneuvers. When attacking an enemy fighter, German doctrine prescribed specific approaches based on the relative positions of attacker and target. The bounce from above and behind, the classic surprise attack, required the target to either turn hard into the attack to spoil the deflection shot, or to roll and dive away to use speed to escape. Both responses were logical, both preserved the fundamental principle of energy management, and both could be countered by an attacker who understood the geometry of pursuit. The hard turn could be met by the attacker cutting inside the turn radius, accepting higher g-forces to maintain a firing position. The diving escape could be countered by following in the dive, using the attacker's altitude advantage to maintain closure. These responses represented rational application of physics and geometry to the problem of aerial combat. What they did not account for was a target who simply skidded sideways in apparent violation of every principle of flight. Webb had come to his amateur skid not through formal training or tactical analysis, but through desperation filtered through instinct during his third combat sortie on July 15, 1940. He had been flying number 2 in a section of 4 Spitfires patrolling south of Dover when a swarm of Bf-109s bounced them from altitude. The German attack came from the sun, perfectly executed, the kind of textbook engagement that killed inexperienced pilots before they understood what was happening. Webb's section leader called the break, a hard turn into the attack that should have spoiled the German firing solutions. Webb began the turn, saw tracers arc past his canopy, and in the moment when rational thought dissolved into pure survival instinct, did something that training had never covered. Instead of coordinating his turn, aileron, rudder, and elevator working in harmony to produce a smooth arc through space, he simply kicked the left rudder pedal to its stop while holding the stick neutral. The Spitfire did not turn in any conventional sense. It skidded sideways through the air, its nose swinging left while its velocity vector continued roughly forward, creating a moment of impossible geometry where the aircraft was pointing one direction while moving in another. The Bf-109 that had been tracking him, its pilot anticipating a coordinated turn and already adjusting his aim to lead the target, fired at the space where Webb's Spitfire should have been. The bullets passed through empty air. By the time the German pilot recognized that his target had done something unexpected, Webb had released the rudder, allowed the Spitfire to stabilize, and was diving for the deck with the survival skills of someone who has just discovered that chaos could be a weapon. The sound of the Merlin engine under uncoordinated flight became the symbolic element that defined Webb's evolution as a pilot, that change in tone when the engine labored against the drag of the skidding airframe, the way the supercharger whine shifted as power demand increased to maintain altitude during a maneuver that sacrificed efficiency for unpredictability. It was not the smooth, purposeful roar of an engine in a coordinated turn or a power dive, but rather a rougher sound almost protesting, as if the Spitfire itself objected to being flown this way. For Webb, that sound became associated with survival, with the seconds between detecting an attack and finding himself still alive when logic said he should be dead. For German pilots who encountered him repeatedly, and there were several who recognized his aircraft by its markings and learned to anticipate his tactics, that sound, if they could have heard it, would have represented something more disturbing. The recognition that their assumptions about how RAF fighters would maneuver had been incomplete. That there existed a region of the tactical solution space they had never mapped because no rational pilot would operate there. The transformation in how Webb's squadron mates viewed his skid began not with official acceptance, but with the gradual accumulation of evidence that whatever the maneuver looked like, it worked. Other pilots who flew with Webb on patrol reported watching German fighters overshoot him repeatedly, watching Bf-109 pilots break off attacks in apparent confusion when their carefully calculated deflection shots missed by margins that should have been impossible. The skepticism that had greeted Webb's first explanations of his evasion technique, skepticism that suggested he had been lucky rather than skillful, eroded as the pattern repeated across dozens of engagements. Squadron leader Henderson, who had initially threatened to ground Webb for dangerous flying, began quietly documenting the encounters in intelligence reports that filtered back to Fighter Command headquarters. The mathematics were undeniable. Webb's survival rate exceeded that of more experienced pilots in his squadron, and his ability to evade attacks allowed him to remain in combat longer, to position himself for counterattacks, to transform defensive situations into offensive opportunities through sheer persistence. By October 1940, as the Battle of Britain reached its climactic phase, word of Webb's skid had spread through informal networks that connected RAF fighter squadrons, the conversations in mess halls, the letters between pilots serving at different stations, the inevitable gossip that accompanied any pilot who survived long enough to become noteworthy. Some squadrons began quietly experimenting with uncoordinated flight as an emergency evasion technique, though most pilots found the maneuver as difficult to execute as it was counterintuitive to attempt. The skid required precise timing. Kick the rudder too early and the attacking enemy had time to adjust. Too late and the bullets had already found their mark. It required immediate recovery. Hold the skid too long and the Spitfire would depart controlled flight entirely, entering a flat spin that was difficult to recover at the low altitudes where most combat occurred. And it required a willingness to appear foolish, to fly in a way that looked amateurish to anyone watching, to accept that survival sometimes meant abandoning the elegant techniques that peacetime training had emphasized. The German response to Webb's tactics revealed limitations in Luftwaffe doctrine that German fighter commanders were slow to acknowledge. The Bf 109E, while an excellent fighter with superior high-altitude performance to the Spitfire, had been designed around assumptions of coordinated combat, of engagements where both attacker and target maneuvered in ways that respected the fundamental relationships between energy, altitude, and airspeed. German pilots trained extensively in deflection shooting, in calculating the complex geometry required to hit a maneuvering target, but those calculations assumed the target would maneuver in predictable ways. The skid, that violent uncoordinated lurch, introduced a variable that deflection shooting techniques could not easily accommodate. A pilot who had mastered the art of leading a turning target, who could judge precisely how far ahead of the target's flight path to aim, found that expertise useless when the target suddenly moved perpendicular to its previous trajectory without executing a turn that could be tracked and anticipated. Major Horst Liensberger, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with 16 victories by November 1940, filed an after-action report following an engagement with Webb's squadron that captured the frustration German pilots experienced when facing this unorthodox tactic. The report, discovered in Bundesarchiv records decades after the war, described an encounter where Liensberger had achieved perfect attacking position on a lone Spitfire, had tracked the target through a coordinated turn, and had opened fire at a range where hits were virtually guaranteed. The Spitfire, instead of continuing its turn or reversing, appeared to skid sideways in uncoordinated flight, presenting its full profile momentarily before recovering. Liensberger's carefully aimed burst passed behind the target, and before he could reposition for another attack, the Spitfire had dived away into cloud cover. The report noted with professional precision that the maneuver represented poor technique, but acknowledged that it had been tactically effective in this instance. The qualification in this instance suggested that Liensberger and his superiors viewed the skid as an anomaly, a lucky accident rather than a repeatable tactic that German pilots would need to counter systematically. The resistance Webb encountered from RAF Higher Command reflected institutional conservatism that pervaded military aviation even in the midst of existential combat. Fighter Command Headquarters, staffed by officers who had learned their trade in the structured environment of peacetime training, struggled to reconcile reports of successful uncoordinated flight with established doctrine that treated such maneuvers as symptoms of poor training. When intelligence officers compiled reports of German pilots complaining about RAF fighters that skidded away from attacks, the initial response from some senior officers was to suggest that German pilots were making excuses for their own poor marksmanship. The possibility that deliberately flying badly might be tactically sound conflicted with decades of accumulated wisdom about what constituted proper fighter-pilot technique. Webb himself was called to Fighter Command Headquarters in November 1940 to demonstrate his skid to a group of senior officers and test pilots. The demonstration, conducted in a Spitfire over the test facilities at Farnborough, produced reactions that ranged from horrified disapproval to reluctant acknowledgement that the maneuver appeared to work even if no one could explain why it should. What made Webb's skid effective was not that it was aerodynamically superior to coordinated maneuvers. It was not, but that it operated in a region of the tactical solution space that enemy pilots had been trained to ignore. German fighter tactics, like all fighter tactics developed through the 1920s and 1930s, assumed that combat would be conducted by pilots who valued their lives and their aircraft enough to fly within the performance envelope that maintained control and preserved energy. The skid violated these assumptions by deliberately entering a flight regime that was dangerous, inefficient, and uncomfortable. It worked because German pilots, confronted with a target that suddenly moved in ways their training had not prepared them for, required precious seconds to recognize what was happening and adjust their tactics. Those seconds, measured against the closing speeds of combat at 300 miles per hour, translated to the difference between hits and misses, between kills and escapes. By December 1940, as the Battle of Britain transitioned from daylight bomber raids to night bombing campaigns, Webb had survived 73 combat sorties and had been officially credited with 5 confirmed victories and 3 probables. His survival, remarkable in a conflict where the average fighter pilot's life expectancy was measured in weeks, had begun attracting attention beyond his own squadron. RAF Fighter Command, while still officially skeptical of uncoordinated flight as standard doctrine, quietly incorporated discussion of emergency evasion maneuvers into training curricula at operational training units. The word skid never appeared in official training manuals, but instructors began acknowledging that in extremis, when standard evasion techniques had failed, pilots might consider aggressive rudder application as a last-ditch defensive measure. This bureaucratic euphemism allowed the RAF to incorporate the lessons Webb had demonstrated without officially endorsing tactics that contradicted established doctrine. The German Luftwaffe's adaptation to skid tactics revealed how slowly institutional military organizations responded to tactical innovations that emerged from individual combat experience. Throughout 1941, as the air war shifted focus to offensive operations over France and defensive operations over Germany, German fighter pilots continued to encounter RAF fighters that employed uncoordinated flight during defensive maneuvers. Luftwaffe training programs, responding to pilot reports, began including instruction on engaging targets that maneuvered unpredictably, but the instruction focused primarily on maintaining disciplined fire control rather than fundamentally rethinking the geometry of attack. German tactical doctrine remained rooted in the assumption that coordinated flight represented the norm and that uncoordinated flight represented pilot error that could be exploited rather than a deliberate tactic that required specific countermeasures. This doctrinal inflexibility, this inability to accept that effective tactics might emerge from what appeared to be poor technique, reflected a broader characteristic of military organizations that valued procedural correctness over pragmatic effectiveness. Webb himself, promoted to squadron leader by March 1941 and assigned to command a fighter squadron, found himself in the peculiar position of defending a tactic he had stumbled upon through desperation rather than analysis. When asked by younger pilots to explain the theory behind the skid, he struggled to articulate anything beyond "it works because they don't expect it." This lack of theoretical foundation troubled RAF training. Officers who believed that tactics should be teachable through rational explanation, that pilots should understand why a maneuver worked rather than simply executing it by rote. But combat experience suggested that the skid's effectiveness depended precisely on its apparent irrationality, on the fact that it violated the assumptions that governed how fighter pilots on both sides understood aerial combat. Teaching it as a formal tactic, codifying it in manuals and training syllabi, might eliminate the element of surprise that made it effective. The skid worked because it was amateur. The moment it became professional, the moment enemy pilots began to expect it and train to counter it, its tactical value would diminish. The statistical analysis conducted by RAF Operational Research Section in mid-1941 provided the most compelling evidence for the skid's effectiveness while simultaneously highlighting the difficulty of teaching it to other pilots. The analysis, based on combat reports from multiple squadrons, found that pilots who employed uncoordinated flight during defensive maneuvers had survival rates approximately 18% higher than pilots who relied exclusively on coordinated evasion techniques. 18%, a number that sounded modest in statistical terms but translated to dozens of pilots who returned from missions that should have been their last, to hundreds of sorties that contributed to eventual victory rather than ending in captured or killed aircrew. But the analysis also noted that only about 15% of pilots who attempted to learn the skid could execute it effectively under combat stress. The maneuver required a specific combination of timing, aggression, and willingness to fly at the edge of control that could not be taught through conventional training methods. It was a tactic that emerged from individual combat experience rather than from classroom instruction, from desperation rather than from planning. By 1942, as Webb completed his combat tour and transitioned to instructional duties, the skid had achieved an ambiguous status within RAF fighter tactics. It was not officially endorsed, not included in training manuals, not taught at fighter schools. But it was not prohibited either, and experienced instructors would sometimes demonstrate it during advanced training, prefacing the demonstration with caveats about how dangerous the maneuver was and how it should only be attempted as an absolute last resort. This unofficial status, neither endorsed nor prohibited, reflected institutional uncertainty about how to reconcile combat effectiveness with procedural orthodoxy, how to preserve the accumulated wisdom of established doctrine while acknowledging that individual pilots had discovered something that worked even if it violated that doctrine's fundamental principles. The German perspective on Webb's tactics, as revealed in post-war interviews with surviving Luftwaffe pilots and in captured documents examined by Allied intelligence, oscillated between grudging respect and professional disdain. German pilots who had encountered Webb or others who employed similar tactics acknowledged that the skid was effective as a defensive maneuver, that it created unpredictability that made deflection shooting difficult. But they also insisted that it represented poor airmanship, that any pilot who needed to resort to such crude techniques had failed to master the fundamentals of coordinated combat flying. This professional dismissal, this insistence that effectiveness without elegance was somehow illegitimate, revealed how deeply both German and British fighter pilot culture valued technique for its own sake, how both air forces had developed institutional identities around the concept of the skilled craftsman who flew his aircraft beautifully even in combat. Webb's skid challenged this identity by suggesting that ugly flying, if it kept you alive, was superior to beautiful flying that got you killed. The transformation in Webb's own understanding of what he had discovered evolved slowly through his years of combat and instruction. In September 1940, when he first skidded away from that Bf 109 attack, he had simply been trying to survive. By 1942, when he attempted to teach the technique to student pilots, he had begun to articulate a tactical philosophy that extended beyond the specific mechanics of the skid itself. The lesson was not that uncoordinated flight was inherently superior to coordinated flight, but rather that tactical doctrine was a map rather than the territory, a framework that provided guidance but should not be mistaken for absolute truth. Enemy pilots trained to counter the tactics described in your doctrine learned to predict your responses based on what they had been taught to expect. The pilot who could temporarily abandon doctrine, who could do something his own training said was wrong, possessed an advantage that technical superiority and numerical strength could not easily overcome. The skid worked not because it was good flying, but because it was unexpected flying, and in combat, being unexpected was often more valuable than being correct. The sound of the Merlin under uncoordinated flight, that rougher protesting tone that characterized the skid, became for Webb a reminder of a larger truth about warfare and survival. Combat was not a test administered by a neutral judge who awarded points for technique and deducted points for violations of form. Combat was survival against an opponent who was trying to kill you, and survival belonged to those who could set aside concerns about appearing professional or following established procedures when circumstances demanded deviation. The sound announced that survival sometimes meant accepting inefficiency, meant flying badly if flying badly kept you alive long enough to fly well again when tactical circumstances improved. It was the sound of pragmatism overriding orthodoxy, of desperation refined into technique, of amateur moves that professional pilots could not counter because they had never imagined anyone would attempt them. By 1943, as the strategic air war shifted toward massive bombing campaigns over Germany and the tactical air war expanded to multiple theaters from North Africa to the Pacific, Webb's skid had achieved a quiet immortality in RAF fighter pilot culture. It was discussed in ready rooms and mess halls, demonstrated during training when instructors felt students were ready to understand its limitations, remembered in anecdotes about the Battle of Britain when old hands traded stories about pilots who had survived through luck or skill or some combination of both that defied analysis. The skid never achieved the formal recognition that other tactical innovations received, never appeared in official doctrine or training manuals in any but the most oblique references. It remained what it had always been, an amateur move, a desperate trick, a violation of proper technique that worked because enemies expected their opponents to fly properly. The amateur nature of the skid, that quality which had initially made experienced pilots dismiss it as the flailing of an incompetent, proved to be precisely what made it effective. Professional fighter pilots on both sides of the conflict had invested years in mastering their craft, in learning to fly with the precision and coordination that defined expert airmanship. They expected their opponents to possess similar mastery, to maneuver in ways that reflected understanding of aerodynamics and energy management and tactical geometry. The amateur move violated these expectations not through superior technique, but through apparent lack of technique, through doing what no skilled pilot would do because skilled pilots understood why it was wrong. In that wrongness lay a kind of rightness that could not be codified or taught systematically, but that existed nonetheless, proven by the simple fact that pilots who employed it survived while pilots who relied solely on proper technique did not. Webb's 14 documented survival events where the skid saved his life. 14 specific engagements where intelligence reports and squadron records confirmed that he evaded attacks that should have been lethal, represented 14 moments when amateur technique defeated professional skill, when the crude overcame the sophisticated, when survival went to the pilot willing to look foolish rather than die elegantly. Those 14 moments, scattered across 6 months of combat, were moments when the accumulated wisdom of fighter tactics proved inadequate, when the textbooks and training manuals and experienced instructors had nothing to offer, when staying alive required doing something that everyone agreed was wrong but that somehow produced the result that mattered, continuing to exist when physics and probability said you should not. And so we return to that foggy morning at Duxford in September 1940, to Flight Lieutenant Webb sitting in his Spitfire waiting for the scramble bell, to the moment before the first combat sortie where he would discover that survival sometimes meant abandoning everything he had been taught. The Merlin engine ticks as it cools, measuring seconds in mechanical time, indifferent to doctrine and tactics and the accumulated wisdom of military aviation. In hours, Webb will kick his rudder pedal hard left and watch German bullets pass through empty air, will discover that the amateur skid works not because it is correct but because it is incorrect in a way that makes prediction impossible. The sound that will accompany that discovery, the protesting roar of an engine under uncoordinated flight, will become the audible symbol of a larger truth about combat and survival and the relationship between orthodoxy and pragmatism. That sound announces that being professional means knowing when to be amateur, that mastery includes understanding when to abandon technique, that the pilot who survives is not always the pilot who flies best but sometimes the pilot who flies worst in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. The skid that Webb will employ 14 times, that will save his life 14 times, that will force German pilots to question their training and RAF commanders to question their doctrine, is not waiting in any manual or training syllabus. It exists only in the space between desperation and innovation, between what should work and what does work, between dying correctly according to doctrine and living incorrectly by violating it. The amateur move that no one could catch, that no one could counter because no one expected anyone to attempt it, stands as testament to the truth that warfare rewards results over method, survival over elegance, the willingness to look foolish over the need to appear professional. In the skies over England in 1940, in the desperate months when invasion threatened and every pilot mattered and survival meant something larger than individual life, Webb's amateur skid wrote a lesson in rudder pedal inputs and uncoordinated flight that no tactical manual could capture, but that every pilot who learned it understood. That sometimes the most sophisticated response to sophisticated tactics is to be so crude, so apparently incompetent, so violently wrong that opponents cannot imagine anyone would fly that way deliberately, and in that failure of imagination lies the margin between continuing to fight and becoming another name on the casualty lists, another pilot who died flying correctly when incorrectness might have saved him.